Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. The social importance of these wetlands gardens cannot be overstated. Agriculture was the foundation on which the Maya civilization was built, and the raised fields and wetlands represent a significant piece of this foundation. These systems enabled the sustenance of large populations in a challenging environment where dry uplands alone could not support such densities. One key to this agricultural success was the integration of farming and water management. The canals that surrounded the raised fields served multiple purposes beyond irrigation and drainage. They were transportation routes for small dugout canoes, allowing farmers to reach distant beds without walking through the swamp. They also created microhabitats that supported fish, turtles, and aquatic plants, which provided supplementary food sources. The interplay between the natural wetland ecosystem and human cultivation was complex. The Maya did not simply impose their fields on the landscape. They worked within it, harnessing the productivity of the wetlands while maintaining ecological balance. Sediment cores taken from these wetlands show layers of organic matter accumulation, evidence of sustainable soil enrichment practices over centuries. Moreover, the wetlands offered a kind of insurance against crop failure. When upland fields suffered from drought or erosion, the raised fields continued producing thanks to their access to water and fertile sediment. This resilience was vital in a region prone to climatic variability, from hurricanes to extended dry spells. The archaeological record also reveals that these wetland farms were not homogeneous. Variations in field size, canal width, and planting patterns reflect adaptations to local conditions, such as soil type, water availability, and seasonal rainfall. Some raised fields had more extensive canal systems to regulate flooding, while others were smaller and designed for particular crops. In addition to food production, the wetlands likely played a role in cultural and religious life. Water was sacred in Maya cosmology, often associated with fertility and the underworld. The act of farming in these watery places may have had spiritual significance, though direct evidence is scarce. Nevertheless, the physical landscape and the cultural landscape were deeply intertwined. One fascinating example is the presence of water lilies and other aquatic plants found in pollen samples. These plants are not typically food crops, but might have had ceremonial or symbolic uses, illustrating how the wetlands were more than just farmland. They were living, breathing spaces woven into the Maya worldview. The diversity of crops in the wetlands also hints at a varied diet that went beyond the maize-centric stereotype. While maize was central to Maya identity and religious ritual, the daily meals of ordinary people included an array of tubers, roots, beans, and greens. This diversity may have helped maintain nutritional health across the population, supporting physical labor and long lifespans. Recent ethnobotanical studies among contemporary Maya communities have uncovered that some of these lost crops, like chaya and malanga, are still cultivated on a small scale. However, these plants are rarely prominent in modern diets, overshadowed by globalized foods and changing agricultural priorities. As we reflect on this, the question emerges: why did so many of these crops disappear from everyday use? Partly, the upheavals following the collapse of classic Maya cities disrupted agricultural systems and cultural knowledge transmission. Later colonial disruptions imposed new crops, livestock, and land use patterns that further marginalized native plants. Additionally, modern agriculture's focus on high-yield staples and export crops has pushed many traditional plants to the edges of survival. The loss is not only nutritional, but cultural, as plants carry stories, practices, and the wetlands themselves have suffered. Urbanization, deforestation, and drainage for modern farming have erased many ancient canals and fields. Yet, pockets remain, and scientific interest in Maya wetland agriculture has grown in recent decades, inspiring efforts to revive and adapt these methods for sustainable agriculture. The notion of forgotten vegetables is a gentle reminder that history isn't only about kings or battles, but about the quiet choices and adaptations that sustain life over centuries. The story of the Maya wetlands invites us to listen more carefully to the soil, the water, and the plants, and to appreciate the subtle wisdom of a people who farmed the unfarmable. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine the delicate green shoots of chaya unfurling beside slow-moving water, the firm roots of malanga stretching into fertile mud, the soft rustle of leaves, and the gentle splash of water. Sounds of an ancient ecosystem and a civilization intertwined. What might the revival of these wetlands teach us today about resilience, balance, and our place within nature's cycles? To understand the genius of the ancient Maya, you must go beyond their temples and astronomy and sink your hands into the mud, quite literally. Their real brilliance may be buried under layers of earth in the thick soils of their raised fields. In this section, we dig deeper into the agricultural methods that allowed the Maya to transform wetlands into fertile farmlands year after year, without exhausting the land or flooding their harvest. These weren't fields as we know them today. These were chinampas, though the Maya had their own terms, raised plots of land built above the floodplain using earth, decaying vegetation, and sediment dredged from canals. The system wasn't just efficient, it was elegant. The canals between the raised beds acted like sponges, soaking in water during the rainy season and slowly releasing it during the dry months. This meant roots were never starved or drowned. In many cases, this natural irrigation reduced the need for daily human intervention. Planting was done in layers. The Maya practiced polyculture, meaning they planted multiple types of crops on the same plot to take advantage of each plant's characteristics. A leafy ground cover like amaranth might grow alongside taller stalks of maize, while climbing beans twined around both. These combinations weren't random. They were carefully chosen to maximize yield, discourage pests, and nourish the soil. While modern industrial agriculture relies heavily on chemical fertilizers, the Maya relied on organic matter and time-honored routines. There's evidence that farmers added lake silt and ash to enrich the soil naturally. Organic waste from fish caught in the canals may have also been returned to the earth. In a quiet way, their farming was regenerative. They grew, harvested, and replanted in a constant cycle, maintaining fertility for decades. It wasn't about mass-producing food. It was about sustaining a community. They even practiced fallowing, giving fields time to rest, which may seem counterintuitive in times of scarcity, but it was a method born of long observation and respect for the land. Fallow fields could be used for grazing animals or for wild edibles to grow naturally. Nothing went to waste. This knowledge was likely passed down orally from one generation to the next. We don't have handbooks or instructional scrolls, but archaeological surveys, pollen samples, and soil cores all confirm that these systems were stable and productive. And the longer you examine them, the more they resemble ecological systems rather than simple farms. In modern terms, we'd call this permaculture. The Maya simply called it life. Farming in a wetland is a year-round commitment. The Maya didn't just plant and harvest. They read the skies, walked the marshes, and learned to anticipate nature's rhythm, like clockwork, because their lives depended on it. The year was divided into two primary seasons, rainy and dry. The challenge? Timing everything perfectly between the two. The wet season, lasting from May through October, could bring torrential downpours and rising waters. A poorly timed planting could drown the crops. The dry season, on the other hand, was harsh. Fields cracked, canals dried up. But with careful preparation, the Maya turned this into an opportunity. During the rainy months, canals were dredged, and sediment-rich mud was spread over raised fields like compost. This replenished the soil and made it ready for planting. After floods receded, moisture remained trapped in the soil layers, allowing crops to thrive through the drier months that followed. The timing of planting varied slightly depending on the crop. Maize was sown as water began to recede, while root vegetables like sweet potatoes and manioc could wait a little longer. Canals were more than boundaries. They were living tools. They absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from temperature swings. Insects laid their eggs in the still water, but frogs, birds, and even fish kept populations in check. In effect, the Maya built miniature wetlands within wetlands, creating ecosystems that balanced themselves over time. These weren't just practical choices. The water cycle was tied deeply to ritual and belief. Ceremonies were held to ask the gods for balanced rains, not floods. Farmers watched the stars and tracked time using the solar calendar, planting with patience and reverence. Nature wasn't something to conquer. It was a partner, sometimes temperamental, but never ignored. This was agriculture on nature's terms, and somehow it worked for centuries. Maize was the cornerstone of Maya agriculture, but it wasn't the only star on the stage. What truly nourished Maya society and what makes their story so fascinating today were the lesser-known crops, some of which have nearly vanished from modern diets. Take chaya, often called tree spinach. Its dark, nutrient-rich leaves were boiled and served like greens, offering protein, calcium, and iron. Then there was amaranth, both a grain and a leaf vegetable, high in amino acids and fiber. It filled bellies while supporting muscle and bone health. Taro and sweet potato were dug from the raised beds, while squashes, from tiny teardrop gourds to sprawling pumpkins, crept over the earth. These weren't afterthoughts. They were staples, each selected not only for taste, but for how well they grew in soggy or compacted soils. Then there's the curious case of huazontle, an ancient Mexican crop related to quinoa, eaten in the form of pan-fried flour clusters. And let's not forget huazontle, the sour cactus fruit sometimes found near marsh edges, used in soups and sauces. Maya farmers knew which plants liked wet feet and which preferred dry ridges. They understood flavor profiles, shelf lives, and the hidden medical properties of their crops. Many plants were dual use, food and medicine. The bark of certain trees was steeped to ease digestion. Spicy roots helped with fevers. Even weeds had purpose. This level of food diversity ensured stability. If one crop failed, another filled the gap. If a storm washed out the maize, chaya leaves were ready to harvest within days. In modern times, monoculture creates vulnerability. The Maya seem to understand, instinctively or through trial and error, that resilience is rooted in variety. It's easy to forget that entire civilizations once depended on plants you've probably never heard of. But perhaps those vegetables aren't lost, just waiting to be remembered. The wetlands gardens were not only feats of engineering, they were social projects that depended on careful cooperation. Raised fields demanded many hands across the year. Clearing vegetation, cutting canals, piling muck into beds, and returning each season to dredge, mend, and replant. No single household could keep the system stable on its own. The day-to-day steadiness you imagine in those quiet plots was built from coordinated labor, shared tools, and routines taught patiently across generations. Work followed the calendar. In the months of heavier rain, crews opened clogged channels and lifted nutrient-rich sediments back onto the beds. At the transition to the drier season, attention shifted to planting, staking vines, and reinforcing bed edges with woven brush and living hedges. During harvests, canoes traveled in narrow convoys, moving roots and greens to higher ground for processing and storage. These cycles created dependable rhythms. Everyone knew when the canals would be busy, when compost piles needed turning, and when beds were left to rest. Tasks were distributed with quiet efficiency. Canal dredging and bed building were heavy jobs, often tackled in group efforts, while seed selection, drying, and careful processing of leafy greens and roots required meticulous attention. Skills that elders guarded and taught. Children learned to recognize healthy soil by feel, to judge water levels by the color of the canal margins, and to read plant health by leaf sheen rather than abstract measurements. Knowledge stayed grounded in observation. Markets, where they existed near wetland zones, amplified this cooperation. A family with an abundance of malanga could trade for amaranth or gourds. Dried root cakes traveled better than fresh greens, so some households focused on preservation and exchange. The wetlands supported specialization without breaking community bonds. The fields themselves bound people together through shared canal walls and common water. Dispute management mattered, too. Boundaries along water are fluid by nature, and keeping a canal clear benefits many plots at once. That reality encouraged negotiated rules: when to dredge, who supplies brush, how to share fallen timber, because neglect on one plot could flood a neighbor's bed. The social contract was written in mud and maintained with steady hands. Because food production was distributed rather than centralized, shocks could be absorbed. If one family's bed failed due to pests or a localized flood, nearby plots often still produced. That redundancy, small, repeated units of production, built resilience into the landscape and into the social fabric. The wetlands thus served not only as farms, but as quiet insurance systems, linking households in mutual dependence. You can think of the raised field mosaic as a living commons, privately tended but collectively sustained, where the success of each strip depended on the integrity of the whole. In that sense, the gardens were as much social infrastructure as agricultural technology. How might our own communities look if we treated water, soil, and food networks as shared responsibilities rather than isolated assets. Water held layered meanings in Maya life. It was practical, a medium for transport, a reservoir for crops, and it was also sacred. In carvings and in the remains of ceremonial deposits, water appears as a portal, a threshold between worlds. Wetlands, with their reflective surfaces and hidden depths, belong to this symbolic geography. Rain itself was a focus of devotion, appealing for balanced rains. Neither drought nor deluge was a necessity woven into ritual life. In regions where karst landscapes funneled water into sinkholes and caves, offerings were placed at watery entrances, suggesting reverence for what flowed unseen beneath the ground. While wetlands farming took place on the surface, it lived under the same spiritual sky that governed ceremonies of rain, fertility, and renewal. In this context, a dredged canal was not only a ditch, it was a controlled line of water in an ordered world. Maintaining the canals kept chaos at bay, both literally by preventing flood damage and symbolically by honoring the balance between excess and scarcity. Fields were not sacralized in the sense of temples, but they existed in a moral landscape where care and reciprocity were expected. Take from the water, return organic matter to the bed, harvest a crop, allow a margin to regrow. The cycle itself carried meaning. Plants had stories and uses beyond the plate. Some leaves and barks were reserved for remedies, infusions, or incense. Certain flowers, water lilies among them, appear in art and ritual associations, marking how aquatic life threaded into belief. Even decisions about fallowing and rotation sat within ideas about order and renewal, time to work, time to let the land recover. This alignment of practice and worldview strengthened the system, when the right thing to do for the field was also the right thing to do in a sacred sense. Compliance did not rely solely on rules. It drew on shared convictions. In difficult seasons, ritual petitions for rain may have reaffirmed solidarity and patience. Practical outcomes and spiritual frameworks moved in tandem, reinforcing the attention that wetlands demand. Set within this wider cosmology, the raised fields look less like a technical trick and more like an expression of harmony, an ethic of fitting human activity to place. What would change in our current food systems if soil health and water balance were treated not only as scientific targets, but as shared cultural commitments? The strength of the wetlands lay in their steady productivity and their connectivity. Canals were arteries. From plot to plot, then outward to broader waterways, goods moved with minimal friction. Canoes hauled more than vegetables, bundles of firewood for drying and cooking, clay for pots, reeds for weaving, and fish caught from the channels themselves. Markets linked these supplies to regional exchange, while upland fields furnished maize and tree crops from household gardens. Wetlands offered an array of roots, greens, and gourds, fresh, boiled, dried, or mashed into portable forms. Drying and grinding stabilized perishable foods for travel. Tubers, sliced thin and sun-dried, kept for weeks. Amaranth seeds stored well in sealed containers. Leafy greens, more fragile, were often consumed locally or blanched and packed for short trips. The wetlands offered an array of roots, greens, and gourds, fresh boiled, dried, or mashed into portable forms. Storage mattered as much as production. Elevated platforms, ventilated baskets, and sealed ceramic vessels extended the life of harvests. Ash, lime, and smoke were used to discourage pests. In parallel, the processing of maize through alkaline treatment made kernels more nutritious and easier to grind, a technique that paired well with wetland crops to round out diets. The economic impact reached beyond calories. Stable supplies from wetlands freed people to specialize. Stoneworkers, potters, tool makers, and traders could rely on a dependable base of food. In turn, those specialists provided the tools, containers, and exchange networks that made wetland agriculture more efficient. That feedback loop, food enabling craft, craft enabling food, helped cities grow. Trade moved in both directions. From inland centers came obsidian blades and polished tools for harvest and processing. From the wetlands flowed practical goods, including cordage fibers, woven mats, and bundled vegetables. In some regions, cacao and salt entered exchange circuits, crossing paths with wetland produce on river routes. The canals, quiet in appearance, carried the hum of an economy. The effect on food security was significant. Diversity of supply made communities less vulnerable to shock. When upland yields dipped, wetland harvests could cushion the gap. When storms swept through, the canals often reopened quickly, restoring movement. The wetlands did not erase risk, but they diluted it across space, crops, and time. Seen this way, the raised fields were not just a clever way to grow in soggy places. They were the damp, steady foundation of regional resilience. If economic systems today were judged by their ability to spread risk and sustain diversity, how different might our priorities look? No system is invulnerable to change. Over several centuries near the end of the Classic period, multiple lines of evidence point to episodes of reduced rainfall in parts of the Maya lowlands. Lake sediments, cave formations that record drip water chemistry, and shifts in pollen profiles suggest that dry intervals strained water-dependent landscapes. Wetlands that once buffered extremes began to feel the limits of their capacity. Lower water tables made canals harder to maintain. Without sufficient flow, silt consolidated rather than circulated, and beds dried more deeply between rains. Plants chosen for damp soils suffered. Harvest windows narrowed, and the margin for error thinned. In some places, deforestation, driven by fuel needs for lime production, pottery firing, and construction, likely exacerbated runoff and evaporation, altering local hydrology. Agricultural stress did not act alone. Population pressures, political rivalries, and disruptions in trade networks created compound effects. Where multiple stressors aligned, communities faced hard choices. Intensify labor to keep fields viable, shift to different land, or move altogether. Archaeological signatures of abandonment at some sites coincide with these environmental signals, though the patterns are uneven across the region. It is important to see decline not as a sudden collapse everywhere, but as a patchwork of adjustments. Some wetland areas continued in use at smaller scales. Others were left to silt over and revert to marsh. Knowledge persisted even where cities emptied. Techniques lingered in villages and on family plots. The system's strength its fine-grained, local adaptation also meant its retreat was local and varied. The wetlands had offered centuries of stability, but their success depended on predictable ranges of water and communal effort. When those conditions shifted beyond familiar bounds, even an elegant design met thresholds. The lesson is sobering and useful. Resilience has limits, and those limits are ecological and social at once. Where in our own landscapes are we nearing thresholds we rarely name? Long after monumental centers grew quiet, traces of raised fields remained under reeds and forest litter. In some places, the outlines of canals survived as faint linear depressions. In others, sediments preserved the pollen of crops once grown on beds, now indistinguishable to casual eyes. The record waited, and when modern tools, airborne laser scanning, satellite imagery, sediment coring arrived, the hidden mosaics came back into view. Scholars studying wetlands in northern Belize, for example, documented networks of canals and beds integrated with surrounding forests and savannas. Elsewhere in the lowlands, subtle ridges and patterned drainage hinted at similar systems. The picture today is uneven, but clearer. Raised field farming in seasonal wetlands was widespread, flexible, and sophisticated. Memory also persisted among descendants, even if names and practices shifted. Some households continued to cultivate moisture-loving crops along marsh edges, maintained ditches for garden drainage, or used plant residues to build soil structure. In recent years, collaborative projects with local communities have tested raised field reconstructions, measuring yields, water use, and soil changes under contemporary conditions. These experiments point to practical promise. Beds built from canal muck and plant matter, warm earlier in the season, drain quickly after storms, and hold moisture during dry spells. Managed canals support fish and edible aquatic plants, creating small, diverse food webs. When paired with low-cost tools and community agreements, revived wetlands can boost household food security without heavy external inputs. The revival is not about recreating the past exactly. It is about adapting its principles: polyculture, water-smart design, soil building, to present climates and social realities. With rising interest in agroecology, the Maya wetlands offer a grounded model. Start with the water, design for diversity, and maintain the edges where land and water meet. Even the lost vegetables are finding new listeners. Chaya is being promoted as a hardy, nutrient-dense green. Amaranth has returned as both a grain and a leaf in small farms. Root crops suited to wet soils are part of climate adaptation conversations. The old portfolio of plants speaks again, not as curiosities, but as tools. What other quiet techniques, sleeping under our feet or hidden in archives, could help make tomorrow's farms both generous and gentle? Set the monuments aside for a moment and hold the wetlands in view. Their lessons are precise. Design for water first. The canals were not afterthoughts. They were the plan. They moderated temperature, stored moisture, and moved goods. In an era of flood-prone cities and drought-stressed fields, planning around water, retaining, slowing, and reusing it, turns risk into resource. Grow many things together. Diversity created nutritional balance and ecological stability. Polycultures tempered pests, shared nutrients, and made failure less likely. Today, mixing crops and rotating them with intention remains one of the simplest paths to resilience. Build soil patiently. Layered organic matter, ash, and char made beds that stayed fertile and friable. Soil is not a backdrop, it is the living engine. Treating it as a craft rather than a consumable aligns with both science and common sense. Organize maintenance as a commons. Shared canals demanded shared care. Agreements about timing, labor, and access kept the system working. Modern analogs, irrigation districts, watershed councils, community gardens, thrive when governance is as thoughtfully designed as the infrastructure. Match crops to microclimates. The Maya placed water-loving plants where roots could sip rather than drown, mapping small variations in moisture and shade, and planting accordingly turns marginal land into steady ground. Honor knowledge that lives in practice. Wetland farming was taught by doing, by touch, smell, timing. Rebuilding such systems requires partnerships with people who know local water and soil intimately, and pathways to pass that knowledge along. Together, these lessons describe an ethic. Cultivate with humility, assume change, and keep diversity at the center. The raised fields of the Maya lowlands do not ask us to romanticize the past. They invite us to notice how much can be accomplished with careful attention and collective effort. As you settle with these thoughts, imagine a map of shallow waters threaded with narrow beds. Each one a small promise kept season by season. Food as a steady chorus rather than a single loud note. Work spread across many hands. Results spread across many crops. In that quiet geometry, the future looks a little less brittle. What would it mean for farms, for towns, for watersheds, if we measured success not only by yield, but by the calm endurance of systems that last?